The war Napoleon couldn't win. In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, stood at the height of his power. He had just crushed the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram and forced them into a humiliating peace. But the war he had started in Spain and Portugal, a war that had already been poorly judged from the start, continued to rage. Napoleon had placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain. Uniting a proud nation against him, his armies responded ruthlessly to widespread uprisings, routing one Spanish army after another. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes stormed the city of Zaragoza after a heroic defense. The brutal siege claimed the lives of 54,000 Spaniards and 10,000 French troops. But the Spanish and Portuguese resistance had not been silenced, and just 3 months after they escaped at Corunna, the British were back in April. Wellesley landed at Lisbon to take command of a small Anglo-Portuguese force. British redcoats would now fight alongside the Portuguese army, which with British training would soon prove remarkably effective. 3 weeks after his arrival, Wellesley moved against Marshal Soult's Second Corps, which had recently taken Porto. Soult's army, preoccupied with plundering the region, had no warning of the British advance and was soon forced into a hasty retreat, back through the mountains into Spain. With Portugal momentarily secured, Wellesley began planning a joint campaign with General Cuesta, commander of the Spanish army of Extremadura, on July 10th. The two commanders met at Cosses de Miravic to discuss strategy. Their alliance, however, was uneasy. Britain and Spain had a long history of rivalry. The Spanish deeply distrusted British motives in Spain, while the British held a low opinion of the Spanish army, which they saw as poorly trained and ineffectively led. Wellesley's request to take overall command of the Allied forces was rejected. Nonetheless, the generals agreed to a joint advance up the Tagus Valley toward Madrid, supported by General Venegas advancing from La Mancha. In response, Marshal Victor's First Corps fell back to Talavera, where he was joined by King Joseph and General Sebastiane's Fourth Corps. The French plan was for Joseph's forces to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult would lead 3 corps from the north to envelop and trap the Anglo-Spanish armies. But Joseph, worried by Soult's slow progress and by Venegas approaching Madrid from the east, chose to engage Wellesley's army at Talavera. At the Battle of Talavera, British infantry bore the brunt of the French assault. They stood firm and repelled the enemy with disciplined musket volleys and bayonet charges. Talavera was a small battle compared to the grand clashes fought that year in Austria, but it proved that under Wellesley, Britain's small, well-drilled army was a force to be reckoned with, even if the victory was short-lived. Warned of Soult's approach by captured Criers, the Anglo-Spanish forces withdrew after their victory. Shortly after, King Joseph and the Fourth Corps marched against General Venegas and routed his army at the Battle of Almonacid. That autumn, Spain's supreme junta, effectively its government, raised 2 new armies in a renewed effort to retake Madrid, converging on the capital from both north and south. But Wellesley, now Viscount Wellington after his victory at Talavera, was so disgusted by Spain's lack of cooperation during the summer campaign that he refused to risk his army again. Predictably, the inexperienced Spanish armies met disaster. At Ococa, they suffered their worst defeat of the war, when a smaller force under Marshal Soult routed the Spanish, capturing 14,000 prisoners and 50 guns. A week later, another Spanish army was crushed at Alba de Tormes. Worse still, the city of Girona fell to the French after a grueling 7-month siege. The junta's plan to reclaim Madrid collapsed, and southern Spain lay open to French conquest. In January 1810, King Joseph marched south with 60,000 men. In the face of his advance, Spanish resistance evaporated. The supreme junta was overthrown in a coup as Córdoba and Seville fell without serious resistance. Joseph, who still hoped to win over Spain through progressive reforms, was welcomed by many as a savior from chaos. Only Cadiz held out, its defences strengthened by a British naval squadron. Marshal Victor's first corps laid siege to the city. Meanwhile, Napoleon sent Marshal Massena to Spain with 65,000 reinforcements, recently honoured as Prince of Essling for his heroics in Austria. Massena was one of Napoleon's best commanders. His mission: invade Portugal once again, capture Lisbon, and drive the British back into the sea. He besieged Ciudad Rodrigo, a key fortress guarding one of the main roads into Portugal. After 2 weeks of bombardment, it surrendered. Wellington, with only 33,000 men against Massena's 50,000, withdrew deeper into Portugal. Massena crossed the border and besieged Almeida. After just 13 hours of shelling, a lucky French shot ignited the Portuguese powder magazine. 70 tons of gunpowder exploded in a massive blast, rendering further resistance futile. It was a serious blow for Wellington, who had hoped the fortress would buy him time. Bukavu. Wellington found a strong defensive position and made his stand. Massena's assault failed, costing him 1,000 casualties. But the next day, the French found a way around the position, and Wellington had to retreat again. As Massena's army approached Lisbon, his scouts made a shocking discovery. Stretching across the Lisbon Peninsula stood a formidable line of fortifications, the lines of Torres Vedras. Secretly built over the past year, they included more than 100 forts, redoubts, and batteries, defended by 30,000 troops and 250 guns. Massena soon realized the lines were far too strong to attack. To make matters worse, Wellington had used a scorched earth strategy, stripping the surrounding countryside of anything that could aid the French. Portuguese guerrillas harassed supply columns as the French struggled through the mountains to reach Massena's main force. Now, Massena was starving, too weak to attack, yet unwilling to retreat. But it was the Portuguese civilians who suffered most, as villages and farms were burned. Thousands fled to Lisbon, where hunger and disease claimed many lives. Back in France, Napoleon was preoccupied with divorcing Empress Josephine and marrying Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. She was now expecting their first child, yet from Paris. Napoleon issued constant orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal demanding bolder action. But by the time his orders arrived weeks late, they were often outdated and showed little understanding of local conditions. Now, he ordered Soult, based in Andalusia, to attack and draw enemy forces away from Lisbon, allowing Massena to strike. Soult laid siege to Badajoz, a fortified city controlling the southern route into Portugal. When 12,000 men of the army of Extremadura marched to relieve it, they were routed and the city surrendered soon after, yielding 8,000 prisoners and massive stores. It was another crushing blow for the Spanish, and yet, remarkably, despite disasters and the loss of so many generals, the Spanish army continued to fight. The courage of its rank and file was astonishing. Victor's first corps, still besieging Cadiz, had been weakened to support other operations. The garrison of British and Spanish troops decided to strike. They landed along the coast to hit the French siege lines from behind, but they were ambushed by the French at Barossa. Despite heavy losses, the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard fought back bravely, but tensions flared between British commander Thomas Graham and his Spanish counterpart, General Opepa. Squandering the opportunity, Soult, alarmed by these events, marched back to Andalusia. Meanwhile, Massena, out of supplies and with no reinforcements in sight, had no choice but to retreat. Wellington's army pursued, uncovering grim evidence of atrocities committed by French troops against Portuguese villages. There were fierce rearguard actions, commanded masterfully by Marshal Ney until he was dismissed by Massena for criticizing his leadership. With the French driven out of Portugal, Wellington besieged Almeida. Massena's refreshed army marched to its relief, and the two sides clashed again at Fuentes de Ocoro. After 2 days of heavy fighting, Massena failed to break Wellington's lines. Almeida fell the next week, though, to Wellington's fury. British mishandling allowed most of the French garrison to escape. Massena had lost 25,000 men in Portugal. Now, he also lost the respect of his officers, especially after bringing his mistress along on campaign. Once hailed by Napoleon as the dear child of victory, Massena was recalled to France in disgrace. Never again given a senior command, Napoleon sent Marshal Marmont to replace him. Meanwhile, Marshal Beresford, the British commander of the Portuguese army, was sent to retake Badajoz with 20,000 Anglo-Portuguese troops as Soult approached to relieve the city. Beresford marched to meet him at Albuera, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Each side suffered over 6,000 casualties, with more than 1/3 of British infantry killed, wounded, or captured. Marshal Soult later said, "You cannot defeat such troops. Though their generals are worthless, I always thought they were bad soldiers, but I was wrong. I broke through their center, and victory was mine, yet they did not know how to run." Soult had been checked, but remained determined to save Badajoz. Marmont marched to support him, and the combined French force pushed the British to abandon the siege. But when Wellington withdrew to strong defensive positions inside Portugal, Soult and Marmont declined to pursue. The French commanders had learned to respect Wellington and the tenacity of his army. Meanwhile, the war in Spain had ground into a stalemate, while British, French, and Spanish armies maneuvered across the Iberian Peninsula. Another war raged daily across its hills, forests, and mountains since 1808. Spanish and Portuguese civilians, militias, and former soldiers had taken up arms against the hated French invaders. They waged a campaign of ambushes and raids known in Spanish as La Guerrilla, the Little War. Its fighters became known in English as guerrillas. The British Royal Navy supplied them with weapons, stores, and farms, often landing supplies. Behind enemy lines, much of Spain's rugged countryside fell under guerrilla control. North of Madrid, Juan Martin Diaz, a former soldier known as El Empecinado the Stubborn One, led a 6,000-strong guerrilla band. In Navarre, Espos y Mina, a former farmer, ran an organized force that disrupted French traffic along the Key Burgos-Bayonne route, branding Viva Mina onto the foreheads of collaborators. In the west, Julian Sanchez, called Elchar, led the self-proclaimed Lancers of Costal, famously wearing a French hussar cap with its imperial eagle upside down. There were dozens of guerrilla bands across Spain, though some were little better than bandits. Terrorizing civilians as much as the enemy, the guerrilla war was brutal, marked by appalling atrocities on both sides. A French soldier's greatest fear was being captured alive by guerrillas, who often tortured prisoners before killing them. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down defending outposts or patrolling the countryside. The roads were so dangerous that French messengers required cavalry escorts of 200 men or more. Many never made it. Those who did brought invaluable intelligence to Wellington. The war in Spain would ultimately cost the lives of 240,000 French soldiers. As was typical of wars in this era, most died from disease, but many also fell to guerrillas and in battles against the British and Spanish armies. It was this twin threat, well-led regular armies under Wellington and a popular uprising that forced the French into a strategic dilemma they could not solve. If they spread out to fight the guerrillas, Wellington could strike. But if they concentrated to crush Wellington, Vast swathes of the country would fall to the partisans. This was Napoleon's Vietnam, his bleeding ulcer. As he called it a war that cost his empire an average of 100 casualties a day, with no clear path to victory. And in 1812, as Napoleon launched his grand invasion of Russia, Wellington and the guerrillas launched an offensive of their own, one that would turn the war in Spain on its head. Napoleon once ruled almost all of Europe, but it was his pride and strategic missteps that led to a nightmare in Spain. The relentless resistance of the local people became an unwinnable war for the mightiest empire of. It's time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history.